Hello. Can everyone take their seats now, please? We're ready to get started for the next Conservative Environment Network event titled "Grown in Britain: The Future for Our Land and Food." I'm James Cullimore. I run the Natural Environment Programme here at SEN. For those who aren't familiar with the Conservative Environment Network, we're the independent forum for conservatives who believe in net zero, nature restoration and resource security. And you can find our full event party conference programme on the leaflets on your seats or by visiting our website or, of course, in your conference programme. I'm going to firstly thank our sponsor, Vertical Future, for enabling us to put on this event today. And we've got a distinguished panel to discuss these issues. We're going to start with opening remarks, starting with the new Farming Minister, Mark Spencer. I will then ask some questions from the Chair, and we will then go to you for your questions, so please have them ready. I'm going to try and take them in batches of 3 or 4 so we can get through as many as possible. So please be ready with your questions and keep them brief, please. We want questions, not statements. But a bit of context behind this discussion today. So with the war in Ukraine and also extreme heat waves across the world, we've seen real disruption to food supplies this year. And coming off the back of the pandemic, there's a real focus now on security and resilience to shocks. And so alongside that, in this country, we're also phasing out EU-style lamb subsidies and moving to our new post-Brexit farm payment regime. And that has attracted some criticism from farmers who at the same time are grappling with labour shortages, rising input costs, and also new trade deals as well. So how can we boost our domestic food security and deliver better outcomes for the environment? This panel will discuss sustainable food production, support for farmers to manage the change with new technologies and new farm payments and incentives coming on board, and also the role of new production methods, most notably vertical farming. So firstly, I'm going to turn to the Farming Minister, Mark Spencer, who's going to deliver some remarks. Unfortunately, the Minister will then have to leave as he has other commitments, but we're very grateful to the Minister for being with us today and speaking with us. So over to you.
Thank you, James. I apologies for not being able to stay for the whole session, but I just wanted to stop and say I wish the session well. I think it's hugely important. We've got massive challenges in the food production sector at the moment in terms of rising costs, and you'll have seen some speculation in the press that we're about to tear up completely our environmental credentials and move in a different direction. I can assure you that is absolutely not the case. I think the government and the Conservative Party is committed to protecting our environment, looking after our food producers and making sure that we have a sustainable future. That goes hand in hand with our farmers and our food producers who also have those aspirations and those desires. I think it strikes me as ironic sometimes that we criticise our farmers for damaging the beautiful countryside, when actually it's the farmers of generations that have created that beautiful countryside that we hold so dear. You know, the stone walls in Yorkshire are only there to keep in the sheep. Without those sheep, the stone walls are not necessary and will not be maintained. And I think that's the same for landscapes up and down the country, whether you look at Dartmoor or Exmoor or Snowdonia. Those beautiful landscapes we hold so dear are created by our food producers and our farmers, and we want them to continue to do that. We want them to be profitable. We want them to engage and enhance that biodiversity and the opportunities that the environment brings them. I think we can do that, but in order for them to do that, the schemes that we put forward have got to be accessible, they've got to be easy to engage with, and they've got to be attractive to those farmers. Unless we do that, then they won't participate and we won't have the positive effect that we want to have. I think there's huge opportunities moving forward. I look forward to hearing what the session comes up with, and I know that Jerome will feed back to me any comments that they need to directly. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Minister. Excellent. Right, we are going to go to our second speaker for today. Jerome Mayhew has been MP for Broadland in Norfolk since 2019 and is currently a member of the Environmental Audit Committee. He is also Chair of the Sustainable Finance APPG, Vice Chair of the APPG for the Environment and APPG for Rural Businesses and Rural Powerhouse, and a very active member of the same caucus. Jerome, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, James, and thank you very much for coming to this event. The areas that I want to talk about, and we've just got 3 minutes, is looking at some of the regulatory changes that we can affect in order to deal with the challenges we've got in UK agriculture, and also how that can improve agricultural performance in a wider world where there's food scarcity and particularly accommodating increased drought measures. So that's one thing. I then want to talk about the economy, market signals. That will take up my 3 minutes. So let's start with regulations. There is, just outside my constituency, a place called the John Innes Centre, which is the world's foremost developer of gene editing. So gene editing is where you can essentially accelerate the natural breeding processes to get benign characteristics in plant species, and also you can do it in animals as well. This will allow us at the John Innes Centre and elsewhere to develop drought-resistant wheat, for example, and other products which will will support the agricultural industry here in the UK, but also has a huge potential globally to support the poor and the food hungry. We are bringing in the genetic technology precision breeding regulations to allow gene editing. Please don't confuse that with genetic modification. It is different. It's where you have the same species being repeatedly bred from. So that's one aspect where the government can get regulations out of the way to allow science to help farmers both in this country and abroad. There's also, if some of you here would have been to Groundswell, which is a conference on regenerative agriculture, which takes place in Ware in Hertfordshire each year. When I was there in the summer, you could see in the technical exhibits the huge explosion of new technology of artificial intelligence, machine learning, the use of drones to undertake low-impact pesticide and insecticide-free or much reduced use of insecticides to improve agricultural productivity. So it's necessary for the Environment Agency and the HSE to recognise that the market is moving. We have to have regulations and oversight to make sure that these new sectors are welcomed, but still we need to make sure that they're safe and that they're safe for the operators and also for the wider environment. But we need to recognise that this is an accelerating area where we want to work in collaboration with industry, with the agricultural industry, and not be held back by a lack of imagination. Now I'm going to come on to market signals. In the mini budget about 10 days ago, there was a lot of criticism around economic development zones, and there was a concern that these might have a negative impact on environmental protection. I've got direct experience of one of these in my constituency, and it's called the Food Enterprise Park. Now, this is an area of 100 acres in Broadland where there's a development consent order for the entire 100 acres, and as a direct result of that, 2 weeks ago, the world's largest vertical farm opened. It's 4 acres. It's by Fisher Farms. And I've been to it twice. Tristan Fisher, who's the chief executive, the only reason why he came there, he's told me this in terms, was because it was easy, because we'd accelerated the process by which you can have the idea and move through construction and therefore production. Because as a former businessman, I can tell you definitively that time kills deals. If we can speed up the process by which innovative agricultural and environmental procedures can be adopted and made a commercial return, we will get growth, but we will also, very importantly get the improved environmental outcome from that vertical farm, because that's 4 acres. It will produce the same agricultural output as 1,000 acres of broadacre farming. And it will use less than 10% of the water to produce the outputs. That is hugely important. It's hugely important in East Anglia, where we're water poor, but it's also enormously important for the future of farming. And then finally, if I've got time, a wider signal. So we've got economic development zones, but there's a wider signal. We need to understand how free markets work, and they respond to opportunities and threats. And to give the right information to free markets, we need a price for carbon. We need a price for carbon to unlock the power of the free market so that every industry can make thousands upon thousands of individual decisions that recognise the true cost of the activity that they're undertaking. And to facilitate that, in my submission, we need something called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, so that we apply a price for carbon, not just for our domestic industry, but for imports. Crucially important that imports have a level playing field with the domestic manufacturing or agricultural industry. And it is that way that we can reinvigorate domestic manufacturing whilst recognising the true cost of carbon and unlocking the power of the free market to start solving some of these environmental problems which, because of poor information, they have caused over the last 200 years.
Fantastic, Jane. That was brilliant and really interesting to hear about how regulatory reform can incentivise new technologies which can improve productivity and reduce environmental impacts, the importance of market reform for attracting green investment and green business, and the importance of a carbon price for sending those signals through the market. I'm now going to come to Joe Gideon, who was elected as MP for Stoke-on-Trent Central in 2019 and was formerly the chair of the APPG on the National Food Strategy. Before entering Parliament, she served as a local councillor for 13 years in Thanet and Ashford and owned a handmade paper import and wholesale business for 10 years. Joe, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm here really because of my interest in food and the food system. I think we all recognise that, as Henry will tell you afterwards, the food system is broken, and part of that is our understanding of land use, of food security. There are a number of issues that we need to address globally, but nationally I think that we need to have a much bigger conversation around what we produce, what we farm, land use. Clearly you've got the three challenges. You've got the food challenge, you've got climate change challenges, and you've got the nature recovery challenge of years of, quite frankly, not really focusing on this issue enough. And I think that when we look at this, to find solutions, we need to have much bigger conversations. So, for instance, I give an example. A local councillor from somewhere in the West Country said, we've just given planning permission for 6,000 homes in my area. And now they've come back and they want to have a planning permission for a very large solar farm on greenbelt land next door to it. Should we give it, or should we have actually required them to put the solar panels on top of the houses when they built them? And that goes to the heart of a fundamental question, which is we know that we need to use land for some of our renewables requirements. We've got biofuel growing, we've got solar farms across the country, and I know that certainly the Labour Party are very keen on the massive expansion of onshore wind, which has an implication for land use. And I think that we need to have much bigger conversations around how this all fits together. I was talking to a farmer at an event in Parliament recently, and he said, look, we're really keen to do the right thing. We just need you to tell us what the right thing is. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? That there's nobody, as the Minister said, farmers traditionally are custodians of our countryside. They are the ones that actually make sure things are as they should be. But they need guidance, and I think that we, well, I say we, I'm a backbencher, so I can't really say we, but the government needs to be part of that bigger conversation. And the bigger conversation is also around what we grow in terms of healthy food and diet and dietary change, because we have, and one of my other passions talking about food is the challenge that we have with obesity in this country, and the fact that diet needs to change. We need to have more plant-based diet, and therefore what we grow will change with that as well. So really looking at the bigger picture, I represent an urban constituency. I think there are 4 farms in Stoke-on-Trent Central. Haven't found them yet. There must be very small ones. They certainly are not sort of large land holdings. But the relationship that people in my constituency have with food has to be helped by this bigger dialogue. So I'm really interested to hear about the vertical farming. piece, and I'm really keen to see shops growing tomatoes up the walls in the middle of my city centre, because I think that we need to also take food production into different areas, different parts of the country, and reconnect people with food and the countryside through new technologies and new innovations. So I think this is such a massive subject. I'm privileged to sit on this panel with so many experts, and I just sit there really as somebody who goes, we've got to do something about this, and there is no single piece of the food production organisation or energy producers that can answer it on their own. So this has got to be a collaboration. It's got to be a really big conversation, and we should have had it by now, Henry. I think we agree, but you know, it's never too late to start in a meaningful way.
Fantastic, Joe, and hopefully this is the first conversation of many, and really interesting and important context that you set out there around some of those competing land uses and the importance of balancing our need for food, energy, housing, and conservation. I'm now going to come to Henry Dimbleby, who co-founded the Leon restaurant chain, is a lead non-executive board member at the Department for Food, Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and led the independent review of the National Food Strategy. Henry, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think it's worth just reminding ourselves what the problem is we're trying to solve. So since 1945, the food system has changed beyond all recognition. And it is actually, in many respects, one of the great innovative successes of humankind. We now feed 7.8 billion people from actually slightly less land than fed 2.5 billion people in 1945. And we actually produce 1.7 times the number of calories per person on the planet than we did back then. But in creating that revolution, in focusing on yield above all else, which was, there was an existential threat in 1945, a real genuine fear of a Malthusian collapse of the human species, we inadvertently caused other problems. So the food system is by far, without any other competing area of activity of human life, the biggest cause of biodiversity collapse. It's the biggest cause of freshwater stress and freshwater pollution. It's the biggest cause of deforestation. And with energy, it's one of the two big causes of climate change globally. In fact, one of the biggest risks to the current food system is climate change, which it itself is causing. And on the other side, which we won't talk about today, it is also by far the biggest cause of avoidable disease. By 2035, the NHS thinks it's going to spend more treating type 2 diabetes alone, one tiny condition caused by bad food, than it does today on all cancers. So the question is, can we take this food system that we've created, which produces all this fantastic variety of food, and also get it to restore biodiversity and to sequester carbon? We actually need the land on which we produce food not just to be carbon zero, never minding how admirable the NFU's vision of this, we actually need it to be carbon negative, because there are significant parts of the economy that are going to continue to emit carbon. And the answer and the analysis that we did is that yes, you can actually. If you look at this country, 20% of our farmland produces about 3% of our calories. There is a very close overlap between areas which are suited to restoring biodiversity and sequestering carbon. And you can do the maths where you create a kind of range of different farms, from agroecological, because there are whole different ecosystems that live on that kind of farming, to more sustainable, higher yielding farms, produce enough food and sequester carbon and restoring biodiversity. We calculated that of the 70% of land that is currently farmed, you might go down to about 65%, about 5% of land would go back to broadleaf woodland, maybe some conservation grazing, and then you would have this range of other farming types. The question then is, how do you make that happen? And actually, really interestingly, the one thing that I think almost everyone agrees on Brexit is it gave us the power to make this change. And what is exciting about being British is we're pretty much the only country that can show that this is possible. but it takes an extraordinary, the landing strip, as we're seeing in the last couple of weeks, of bringing the environmental organisations on side, keeping the farmers on side. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. The landing strip is very narrow, and the risk is, and what I'm terrified about at the moment, we go back to a basic payment system effectively, and then what happens is when the Treasury comes back to look and they say to DEFRA, what have you done? You know, we said you could keep the 2.5 billion of common agricultural policy money, and DEFRA is unable to say, look at the nature we've restored. You then get a complete collapse of funding from Treasury. The Treasury will say it's not 2.4 billion, it's 1.8 billion. I'm constantly saying to Minette Batters, stop telling them to try and delay it, because you are going to regret that. That is going to end in your funding being cut. So at the moment, when we talk, and just kind of come back to your original question, when we talk about food security and worries about food security, there are two significant and real problems with food security in this country. One is food prices. For the least affluent 5% of the country, most of us, it's about 10% lowest it's ever been. For them, it's 30% going up to 40%. That is not going to be solved by giving basic payments to farmers. The other problem is that we actually end up with an ecosystem that can't support farming in the future, and that needs to be solved by a doubling down on elms. So it is very difficult. It's a difficult climate, and I wish this administration, this new administration, all the wisdom and political spirit and nous to land it, because if we do land it, we will have led the way and we'll have shown the world that this is possible.
Thank you, Henry, and you've certainly given them a significant helping hand through the National Food Strategy, which is a fantastic and incredibly comprehensive piece of work. And for those who haven't read it yet or aren't familiar with the recommendations, I do suggest that you take a look. I'm now going to turn to Eamon Ives, who's Head of Research at the Entrepreneurs Network. Eamon was formerly Head of Energy and the Environment at the Centre for Policy Studies and Special Advisor to the COP26 President. Eamon, over to you.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and thank you to Sen for all the stuff you've been doing, not least during the leadership election this year. I was a little bit worried that Jerome would take the thrust of what I wanted to say in my own speaking remarks, but I think we just about avoided that. I do want to talk about genetic editing, and because we've got two parliamentarians on this panel, I'd like to talk about a piece of legislation currently going through the House of Commons called the Genetic Technology Precision Breeding Bill, very snappily named. I think if we get this legislation right, it would be a huge boost to not only the UK's food security, but also its environmental credentials as well. In a nutshell, this bill will set out the rules and regulations which apply to genetic editing, a real Brexit opportunity for the UK. For the uninitiated, and Jerome kind of touched upon this already, but there are genetic editing kind of refers to the process of when plants or animals kind of have their genetic code slightly tweaked to promote certain desirable characteristics. And the benefits they could offer are numerous and significant. So, for example, what if we were to breed crops which require less fertilizer? The production of fertilizer is in itself a massive driver of climate change, and when it's perhaps misused or applied badly onto fields, it can cause dramatic devastation for lakes and rivers and things like that, which I think has become a hugely salient political issue lately. What if we were to breed crops which are more resilient to drought and drier conditions? We only have to think back to this summer to remember those stiflingly hot days that devastated some farmers' crops and harvests. I think that's only going to become more commonplace, so we need to think about how we can adapt to that hotter world. We could use genetic editing to make plants more resilient to pests or diseases. This could dramatically cut the need for pesticides, something which would be a blessing for Britain's pollinator species, which all too often get caught in the chemical crossfire. Above all else, genetic editing would allow us to get much higher yields, so more food per acre that's farmed. With that farmland, we could perhaps restore some to nature, maybe planting trees on it which can absorb carbon from the atmosphere, or we could keep that land in production, bolstering our food security. Some people have voiced their opposition to genetic editing, perhaps saying it's unnatural or something like that, but I'm afraid that's a total misunderstanding of the science, to be quite blunt. Anything genetic editing can achieve can be achieved just through sort of normal, conventional selective breeding, which we've been doing for millennia. The thing that genetic editing does is it allows us to have more control over that process. So if anything, it's actually a safer way of hopefully getting those desirable characteristics that we want to see. As I say, the genetic technology bill is going through Parliament at the moment, so I think for the sake of our environment, it's critical that it completes that journey roughly in the form that it currently exists. So I was going to say, to wrap up, my plea goes to Joe and Jerome to please make sure it does. It sounds like, Jerome, you're already convinced of its merits. I hope you are as well, Joe, because like I say, I think it's a really important bill at the moment. I'm quite confident it will get passed in a good way, but you should never get complacent in politics.
Thanks very much, Eamon. It was a brilliant exposition of the environmental and food security benefits of precision breeding technologies, and a really important piece of legislation going through Parliament at the moment. Finally, we're going to turn to Jamie Burrows, founder and CEO of Vertical Future. Prior to setting up Vertical Future, he worked in life sciences at EY, Deloitte, and the UK Department of Health. Jamie is also a graduate of the prestigious Leadership Enrichment and Development Programme in the US, Air Force Academy, and holds an honorary bachelor's degree in business economics from Buckingham University and a master's in energy, trade and finance from the Cass Business School. Jamie, over to you.
Thanks very much, and thank you for the invite today, and for reading through my bio, which is very exhaustive and has nothing to do with vertical farming, but I'll take people through this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our company and why we do what we do, and some of the challenges and opportunities that exist right now in the agricultural sector, and specifically for vertical farming for obvious reasons. Vertical Future was set up in 2016. We're a technology and R&D company that have about 100 staff, and we supply vertical farming technologies across the world. So our main kind of target geographies are obviously UK and mainland Europe, the Middle East, and Singapore. Obviously today we're going to very much focus conversation on Britain. So one of the reasons I got interested in vertical farming, coming from kind of a health background, is because it addresses so many important issues, not just in terms of planetary health, but in terms of human health. If you look at the current state of the food system and the way this has been for decades now, since the kind of agricultural revolutions of the 60s and 70s, it appears to be sustainable for things like organic products, but isn't necessarily. So as an example, we fly herbs in from Kenya. We fly cut flowers in from Kenya via Holland. A lot of that's coming, it's coming through a cold supply chain, and then companies are spending hundreds of millions of pounds a year just storing these products in the UK to get them to customers. We're covering our products in pesticides. Pesticides have been linked to numerous health conditions, infertility being one of them. And this is really something that we should take more seriously. Then there's obviously land use. So vertical farms can't grow everything, or they can grow everything, but it wouldn't make sense to because the economics wouldn't stack up. But of the products that can be grown, if you walk through a fresh produce aisle and you look at probably about a third of the products can be grown sustainably in vertical farms and at a price parity to foreign imports if you set up a decent sized farm, a bit like what Fisher Farms have done. So our systems, for example, can produce the same amount 600 times the amount in the same space of land. So the good thing about that is we're freeing up land for obviously improvements in biodiversity, which is a very, very important thing. So human health angle, freeing up land, having shorter supply chains. I think CO2 related to kind of bringing products from places like Spain and Kenya is still a very small proportion of the overall kind of carbon footprint associated with vertical farms, but is nevertheless very important. In terms of the challenges that we've faced over the past, I'd say, decade or so, since this has become very kind of attractive, mostly driven by investment in US companies. One of them has obviously been investment. So I think we're finding that if we were speaking to venture capital and PE firms 2 to 3 years ago, they'd be looking at like a VC or PE investment. They'd expect a 2 to 3 year exit on a 3 to 4x multiple. Now we're actually seeing a lot of infrastructure companies get involved in this. On your seat, you'll see a pamphlet which talks about one of the projects we're doing about 15 miles away from Birmingham, where we're building a large vertical farm, which is literally hole-in-the-wall approach. You grow your products on site, they go through the wall, and we're working with one of the leading recipe box companies and a major retailer. And I think what we've seen from Fisher Farms, and also I'm glad that we're talking a bit about genetics as well. We've done a lot of research in this area as well. Every year we're seeing larger and larger vertical farms being built. But with this, we need more capital investment, more support from the government. I think we have seen some governmental support on a regional level, but that hasn't necessarily been anything centrally. We've done a lot with Innovate UK in terms of grants, but that doesn't obviously fund infrastructure build-out. And just to finish in terms of the size of the opportunity, but also the size of the challenge in terms of the amount of capital that needs to go into this sector, we're talking about tens of billions, if not 100 billion plus of capital that's required to actually build vertical farming infrastructure. At present, we're not looking to supplant traditional farms. We can actually work with traditional farms, broadacre farming. But in the future, if the climate continues to go the way that we think it's going, a lot of these traditional farms are going to have bigger and bigger challenges that they face. So vertical farming could play a bigger role.
Thank you ever so much, Jamie. And we'll move to questions now. And I'll start with some questions from the chair, but we'll then go to the audience. So please do have your questions ready. I want to pick up on vertical farming. Firstly, its cost competitiveness and some of the barriers to scaling it up, and perhaps consider some of the supply side changes that the government could make to act as an incentive. So something around change to planning rules or tax incentives, such as a green super deduction for investments in this kind of technology, or exemption from business rates in line with conventional agriculture, or removing barriers to on-site solar. Those kind of things that could help businesses like Vertical Future.
Sure. So there's no doubt that I think a lot of the vertical farms to date, especially as this has been driven by kind of a US narrative, have used a lot of the kind of underlying value propositions like less water, greater productivity, and so on and so forth to push up prices. And really, that's not something that we're advocates of. I think the only way that you address the kind of inequality and price parity angle is by building at scale. So each product you're growing, whether it's coriander or a head of lettuce or tomatoes, are going to have a particular level of scale that's required and capital investment in order to achieve that. So I think there's been a lot of bad press associated with vertical farms, mostly because we're in a very nascent stage for the industry, but things are gradually improving. From a planning standpoint, so we've just built another vertical farm in Northamptonshire, which was on a kind of a sited on agricultural land, so that was much easier. But a lot of the larger developments that we're looking at in peri-urban and rural areas that aren't on farmland, if you're paying business rates, it really eats into the margins. So it's very, very difficult to kind of reach price parity. So, and then final point is that there's actually very little regulation. So a lot of people are interested in buying a vertical farm. It's quite easy to set something up, but setting up something that actually makes sense, that links in with sustainable forms of energy and has the the planning approvals for things like solar energy and battery storage and integration with wind and so on. I'm also a big advocate of nuclear, is very, very important, and I think is lacking in some areas.
Fantastic, thank you. Henry, I'm going to come to you, if I may. Innovation was a big part of your recommendations in the food strategy, in particular on alternative proteins. Could you sort of outline some of the things that you guys were looking at and some of the recommendations that you made to government?
Yeah, so in order to kind of to get that equation right that I talked about, to solve food for biodiversity, calories, health, and carbon, you need to do a couple of things. First of all, you need to be quite explicit about how you're going to use your land. So we need to look much more carefully when we create incentives about which bits of land you incent to do what, because you might want very different things happening in Cumbria, from East Anglia, from the southwest where I'm from. The second thing you need to do is we need to eat less meat. So 85% of the land that is currently used to feed Britain, which actually is an area of land significantly bigger than the United Kingdom, is used either to grow meat or to grow plants to feed to meat. the weight of animals on the planet at any one time is 10 times the weight of all wild animals and twice the weight of all human beings. So it's just too much, take up too much land. And it is politically incredibly difficult. I don't think we did a lot of work in terms of governments trying to get people to not to eat meat. People actually don't mind sugar taxes. They hate the idea of anyone getting involved in meat. And so there are a couple of ways that you can do that. And one is through alternative proteins. So there are 3 alternative protein, broadly speaking, technologies. There's taking pea proteins, soy proteins, and just turning them into protein. There's fermenting, so genetically engineering bacteria to produce certain proteins, which is the same process used for making insulin for diabetics. And then there's actually cellular meat production, so taking stem cells and growing meat in a vat. I actually think the first 2 of those, I tend to think that the third one will never be cheap enough. It will be too expensive. The first 2 of those, I think, will be huge, in particular in places like Egypt, who just aren't going to be able to produce that, are much more vulnerable to the Ukrainian situation than us. They want protein security. And I think this government, at the moment, is another area where we've got an opportunity, having come out of the EU, there are lots of alternative protein companies in this country. I spoke to one just the other day who's saying the government says it's going to do something, but I've got to make a decision in January, February about whether I move to the States, whether the regulation clears up, because at the moment the regulation is too strict. So I really hope that is an area where we can keep those companies and keep that innovation in this country.
Eamon, I want to come to you quickly on this, if I may. The government is looking closely at how they can attract more investment in this country through tax incentives. Would something like a green super deduction, so full expensing on green capital investments plus 20%, be one mechanism the government could look to use to increase investment in innovative technologies like vertical farming or cellular meat or others?
I think absolutely, yeah. This is obviously kind of a policy that was brought in maybe a couple of years ago, was it? Where businesses could have sort of a more generous capital allowance on spending they made. I think it makes a lot of economic sense. I was very glad at the recent mini budget that the thresholds were sort of maintained at £1 million going forward. So they were due to stop next year. I think absolutely there's companies you go all around the country, and it doesn't just need to be green stuff, but you could obviously kind of make a carve out or something like that, where people want to sort of be building things and creating new equipment. And at the moment, our tax system, previously our tax system kind of disincentivized doing that. So yeah, I think if we could see those sorts of allowances being baked into the tax system, that would be a very good thing.
Fantastic. And final question for me, I want to touch on our post-Brexit farm payment reforms. There's been quite a lot of discussion about this over the past week, Jerome. How important do you think public incentives for regenerative farming, for example, are going to be, not just for hitting our environmental goals, but also for improving our resilience to drought, to biodiversity loss, to all these other pressures on domestic food production? And where do you think government policy should go to deliver what the Minister was saying around accessibility of the schemes and value for money and other issues that have been raised by farmers?
Okay, so we're all focusing on elms. I think it's much more fundamental than that. Just this week, I had a meeting with the NFU and the Environment Agency in Norfolk to talk about the removal of water abstraction licenses because we've got such water scarcity in East Anglia that farmers are having their water abstraction licenses removed. Now, that is a big deal. If we want to carry on farming, that is a big deal. But they were required to by some Dutch legislation, weirdly, litigation rather, to do that. So the short-term solution there is building reservoirs. So moving from abstraction from aquifers, underground or from rivers, to collecting excess winter flow, which we're getting more of because we're getting intense rain in the winter and then longer, drier summers. And the challenge that we have right now is a disconnect between what the Environment Agency is saying we need to do as farmers and what the planning authorities are doing in the regulations and the process of getting planning permission in order to build reservoirs. And then there's only a certain time of year that you can actually get the diggers out for environmental reasons. And so farmers are in a really, really difficult position. I don't actually think, I should declare, I'm a director of a farming company as well as being a member of parliament in my constituency. I don't think that's fundamentally about government subsidies and the like. That's actually being businessmen, looking at the risks of your business and taking steps to mitigate them. As to what government money should go into farming, I'm a big supporter of the environmental land management scheme. I think the concept is absolutely right, that we're starting to pay for public money for public goods. That we want to incentivise, first of all, the stopping the continued decline in biodiversity in this country by 2030, which is the government's commitment, and then to reverse it. And if we're going to do that, carrying on supporting farmers in the way that farming's happened since 1945 is not the answer. When I was born in 1970, since 1970, Henry will correct me, I think I'm right in saying that 60% of all biodiversity has been lost since I was born. Just think about that.
20% since 2000.
Yeah. So the status quo is not the solution. We do need to focus where there is need for government support. It's to buy things which currently don't have an economic value. And that's where ELMS should step in.
Fantastic. Joe, Jerome says the status quo is not an option. Do you agree?
I absolutely agree, which is why I'm having a food summit in Stoke-on-Trent on November the 4th to look at this whole food system issue, which I've nicked the name of Henry's report. So it's called From Field to Fork, the Future of Food, because we need to have these really, really big debates. We talked about the urban opportunities. Later in the week, you may all be going to a presentation on the future of high streets and communities and pride of place. And I think that there's a real role for food growing, vertical growing within an urban setting to actually re-engage people with the importance of food, of healthy eating, of health in general, and of food security. So we have to have those bigger conversations. They've already been started. We need to make sure that they continue, and the new administration takes up the research has already been done. It's already out there. So we just need to enact it.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, I'm going to go to audience questions now. Where the microphone is at the back, so we'll start at the back. I'm going to take them in batches of 3, but I'm going to be geographically specific because there's only one microphone and I don't want to lose time walking from one side of the room to the other. So if we start at the back, the gentleman with his hand up in the back of the centre, yeah. Brief questions, please.
Sure. My name's Ali. I work for FairShare, with the UK's largest food redistribution charity. The National Food Strategy said that 1/3 of food is wasted before it even leaves the farm gate. We've got a scheme where we work with farmers to make it cost neutral for them to get their food to charities via our network of warehouses. That was funded by government originally. It no longer is because that funding's been axed. We're seeking the reinstatement of that funding. Joe, you've previously been supportive of that. Jerome, it would be great if you could add your name to the letter that we're writing to the PM. We're at stand B1.
Thank you. Next.
Question or statement?
Yeah, let's keep them to questions, please. Helena from the Guardian, please. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So, Henry, I spoke to you a while ago about the food strategy when it first came out. You said there are a lot of questions that were not answered, but you were hoping they'd be answered in the Health Inequalities White Paper. Well, it seems that's now been scrapped. So do you think the government has no longer got the momentum to change the way that we produce our food and health inequality? Do you think they've stopped caring about it? And to the MPs, I'm sorry, it's slightly unrelated, but I have to ask, do you support the government's 45% tax cut, and will you be voting for it when it comes up in Parliament? Thank you.
We'll take one more question from the audience, please. Yes, the lady next to Helena, please. Thank you.
Yes, Isle of Wight, we're semi-rural. Obviously, first of all, why aren't we promoting councils to create more allotments the allotment for riding example is a colossal waiting list and an opportunity for people to grow their own. The one thing we have to do in life is eat. Secondly, reservoirs, which have been mentioned. When I watch the water pouring off the fields on the Isle of Wight over the cliff into the sea, I could cry. The Third World War, I was once told, would be fought over water. Anyway, comments, please. Oh, by the way, I attended Fisher Farms. Folks, if you get the chance, have a look on the web. It is phenomenal what that man has invented.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We're going to put these questions to the panellists now. Henry, can I ask you to take both the question on food waste, but also the question from Helena on health inequalities white paper as well?
So on health inequalities, I think that's tomorrow's sessions is health. So there are two areas where I think there is jeopardy at the moment in terms of the recommendations from the food strategy. The one is ELMS, which we've talked about. So, as Jerome said, the structure for ELMS, we have legally binding targets in the Environment Bill. In the Agriculture Bill, we have a commitment that the payments under the farm programme will be for public goods, not for other things. But we don't have much else in that. Originally, DEFRA had said there would be a third money into sustainable farming incentive for individual farms, then local nature recovery, which is kind of farmers working on a catchment area scale, and then landscape recovery, which is a big restoration. And that is what is currently up in the air. And there's a fantastic team on DEFRA who've been working on that in great detail. I think that it's really important that lands properly, and I hope that the new administration, when they come in and do the right thing in that area. The other area is the health inequality white paper. So that is how do we deal with the fact that our food is killing people, and it's particularly killing poor people. And to give us a sense of how bad it is, Chris Whitty, probably the world's busiest man during the pandemic, gave a series of online lectures on diet-related disease, like in his free time, because he is so scared about what's going to happen is the NHS is just going to suck up, as well as the misery, the NHS is going to suck up the money from the rest of the economy until we sort this out. Yeah. And the Sajid Javid was about to publish an inequalities white paper when Boris resigned. The rumour is that Therese Coffey's pushed it back again. It's got to, either way, the system's got to change. It'll either change because it collapses or because we do something about it. And I really hope, Therese is a very detail focused person. It's very interesting. People go into the health service thinking, I don't believe in this nanny state stuff, and then they see the problem. And like one after another, they're like, shit, we've got to do something about this. So I hope that she will be seeing that, seeing the data, visiting hospitals, realising there's a problem and then doing something about it.
Jerome, anything you want to add to that, and particularly the question perhaps on food waste, but also the third one on homegrown food, okay. And 45%, yeah.
So on food waste, it sounds like a good idea. I can't comment on the particular programme that you put forward, but I'll come and visit you on stand B1. As to the 45% growth, I'm going to take it because it's obviously it's an important issue. I'm just going to say there are two answers to that question. One's political, the other one's economic. On the economy, it's absolutely the right thing to do because you look at the data and it supports this. The last time the top rate of income tax was reduced, the percentage of tax that was received from that cohort went up. So if we're interested in supporting the poor and our national services, we want to talk about getting tax revenue, not having a sort of virtual signalling, we need a higher rate of tax because they're rich. So economically, it's absolutely the right thing to do, and Labour agrees with us. Why do I say that? Because they were in power for 10 years as a Labour government under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and for all but a month of those 10 years, they agreed that the correct top rate of tax was 40%. So economically, it's absolutely the right thing to do. Politically, we can see over the last few weeks, it's a more nuanced argument, I think it's fair to say. As for allotments, madam, they're brilliant. They should be encouraged. That's the sort of level that parish councils can get involved. If you've got a bit of local land. Often villages have local land which they can adopt for allotments, and it speaks into the very, very important and conservative concept of social capital. And there's going to be an announcement this evening at 6 o'clock, a pamphlet being co-authored by myself, but largely driven by Danny Kruger MP, talking about the importance of social capital. So I'm just going to put a pitch out there.
And me.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Sorry.
We're going to go to our next batch of audience questions. Can we start with Adrian on the...
Hi, a question for Henry at Dimbleby. Given the increased cost of farming in a 1.52 degree warm world, I'm fascinated to know why you think alternative protein production will still not be competitive. Could you just elaborate on that for a moment?
Next question from the gentleman in the side, yes.
Hi, yeah, sorry. Question also for Henry. I'm sure you will have seen an interview with the Environment Secretary this week where, when asked if the public should reduce their meat consumption, he said, no, they shouldn't. They should eat what they like, and that the private sector innovation in animal feed would sort of solve the problem. Could you comment on that?
And the gentleman next, yeah, pass the microphone over, thank you.
Yeah, I'm Nick Palmer, Compassion World Farming. In the aftermath of the discussion on meat, would the government at least agree that it would be helpful not to actively promote increased meat production? For instance, schools are required to serve meat a certain number of times per week. The AHDB promote it. Wouldn't it be good if the government was at least neutral?
Fantastic. Thank you. Henry, could you take the first two questions, please?
I could take the third as well, because I chaired the group that drafted those regulations.
Go for it.
Just on alt protein, actually it's just one form, the cellular, so where you take the stem cells and then feed them a solution. That one just seems to be miles behind the others. So where something like fermented milk powder, 60% of the milk powder that New Zealand sells to China, milk and New Zealand sells to China is in the form of powder, very soon that is going to come down below the price of actually putting that through a cow. Why on earth would you put it through a cow? So it's just a one form of production. But then there are people much richer than me who are investing a lot of money in it, so I may well be wrong. On meat and kind of the idea of why government are promoting the message. I did a piece of work for Michael Gove when he was in education on school food, which ended up with universal infant free school meals, cooking being compulsory on the curriculum, and we changed the food standards from kind of technical science-based standards to food-based standards. And one of the ways at that time in which we tried to get iron up and protein up was to have meat on the menu, I think twice a week, I can't remember. I don't think that's appropriate now, so I wouldn't actually, I'm going back to talk to the FE about that. I think you should enable schools to manage for protein, not have to put meat on. And then in terms of Ranil, I completely understand why politicians don't want to talk about it. So we did, as part of the work on the food strategy, I raised some money outside government and asked Isaac DeVito, who was the Tory kind of election strategist, to do some focus groups on the recommendations. So I wanted to be able to present government with the recommendations saying, here they are, and people want to do them. We did focus groups all over the country, red wall constituencies, all different demographics, and they were fascinating. So on things like health and sugar tax, people are fed up with having their children flogged crap. They were actually very much in favour of advertising regulations. They were very much in favour even of a sugar tax. When you started talking about meat, a significant minority, about 40%, got very, very angry indeed. And that's why in the recommendations in the food strategy, I actually said, I don't think it is politically doable for a government to do this. So that's why we said put money into alternative proteins, change the buying standards so people can buy less meat from government, and actually there's a big advertising agency who read the food strategy, who is putting all their pro bono work towards trying to create a campaign to kind of get away from the idea of eating less meat being kind of militant vegan thing to do, and just try and encourage us all. You know, we need to reduce by about 30%. That's about one meatball a day. So it's not a huge shift, and I do think that's something that can be done without the heavy hand of the state being required to do it.
Can I just add that not all meat is the same? There's overwhelmingly British-produced meat is much better environmentally than many other forms of meat which come in at the lower end. So, and you're quite right, you don't want, as a politician, to be telling people what to do, particularly as a Conservative politician. We need to be giving choices, better and better choices, better and better information, and let people decide for themselves. But I would say that British-produced, high-quality meat is good for the environment in terms of biodiversity management in many areas, and it's not all meat is the same.
Joe, can I just come to you briefly on that topic around diet, but also particularly the role of the public sector and public sector procurement in driving, sourcing more sustainable, locally produced food, which is a lower environmental footprint, but is also healthier for people using our public services?
Absolutely. So I think there is certainly a really big role in public health that we currently aren't, I think, fulfilling in terms of advising people on nutrition, advising children in schools. I was we've got the worst dental health problems in Stoke-on-Trent of children with tooth decay. And there's a big scheme called Keep Stoke Smiling, where they go into schools and try and persuade schools to take out their fizzy drink machines. And you'd think that that's logical, but there's also a suggestion this is about free choice and it's not that harmful. I think we need to be honest about what is harmful and what, without being too. I try to move away from the term nanny state because we all know it is so emotive and it suggests that it's in some way anti-conservative and anti-free choice, and that's absolutely not what it's about. But I think we do have a responsibility to share the knowledge that we have about public health issues and the problems with diet, obesity, all these things have to be discussed in a much more neutral way, I would say, so that it doesn't stigmatise people, and the education that we need to provide, has to be through our schools as well as, I would say, a much bigger campaign, and certainly in terms of public sector procurement and everything, we should be having good food in our schools and our hospitals, and we need to define what good food looks like. And I've been calling for a good food bill. I think that is fundamental to us understanding how we change the dynamic.
Thank you very much. And I think the last batch of audience questions, we really are running out of time, so please keep your questions very brief, and then we'll seek brief responses from the panellists. Can we start with the gentleman? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Does the panel feel that the rate of change from the government meets the needs of the problems we're facing?
Fantastic, thank you. And the gentleman in front.
Yes, thank you. One of my big bugbears is us putting solar panels on grade 1 and grade 2 farming land. I mean, there should be no discussion. It goes on the building roof, not in the land. In Norfolk or on the Norfolk-Suffolk border, they're trying to talk about putting 2,500 acres down to this. That can't be right.
Fantastic, thank you. Final question. Yes, the gentleman there, pass the microphone along.
One of the problems with our food supply at the moment is the depletion of trace elements and minerals in the soil. If we go for increased yields again, this will surely diminish even further the amounts of, say, magnesium in our soils. If we go vertical farming, I don't know where we had it.
Thank you. We've got to seek responses now from our panellists.
What I really want, though, is somewhere I can reference.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Right, Jamie, I want to come to you. Is the pace of change adequate for the challenges that we're facing?
No.
No? Okay,
Really quick.
On solar, who wants to take the solar question? Eamon, can you come on solar?
Yeah, I mean, I generally, on these issues, think people should be allowed to do what they want with their land. I think when we've seen, particularly during the leadership contest, things about like banning onshore wind and then maybe other people wanted to bring it back. I think let people do what they want with their land. Within reason, I think there are certain caveats in place around that and sort of community consent and things like that. But I think there's a lot more willingness for this than people might think. So yeah, let's get that ban lifted.
Jerome, you might want to say something on solar, but also soil health as well.
Yes, so on solar, it's about the comparative utility. So the quality and the use of that soil and that land for agriculture compared to other uses. I think it's a cost-benefit analysis on almost a field-by-field basis. You and I are neighbours in Norfolk, best place to be, and you're right, we've got very good quality land in the main, so it's unlikely that the utility would be better served by solar panels when you've got very good land. The rate of change, all government moves too slowly, that is just the human condition. But this government has done more for the environment than any other in history. And we as Conservatives should be enormously proud of the steps that we've taken, both in terms of the Environment Act, bringing in elms, removing ourselves from the Common Agricultural Policy, which has been so devastating to not only our land, but the whole of Europe, and the environment and the environmental protections and degradation that's happened as a result of that. So we should be enormously proud of what we've achieved, but there's more to go, and we shouldn't take a step back as this administration changes. And finally, on trace elements, I am totally ignorant, so I can't give you the answer.
I'd like to hear from Jay, because I'm always interested in whether that's a long-term concern.
So there are no peer-reviewed studies that will show that a vertically farmed product versus something grown in a broadacre farm will be any less healthy for you. They're very, very similar. What we do in vertical farms is we take in water from mains, so it's recycled, we strip it down, we then add different nutrients, and then we add micronutrients. And obviously, as the water then comes back through the system, some of those are lost, and we add again. But it's kind of a bit of a misnomer. I think the great thing about not using soil, if you take 2 bags of soil, they're going to have very different properties. They're going to have lots of bacteria, lots of insects, and if you grow that in an indoor, very controlled environment, you lose that control.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jamie. We're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid, as we are now out of time. Thank you to our speakers for that excellent discussion, and to our sponsor, Vertical Future, for enabling us to put on this discussion today. The next event in this room is on energy efficiency with the Minister, Lord Callanan. And if you are not already, please do sign up as a SEND supporter for free on our website. There's a QR code on our leaflets as well, so it's nice and easy. Please do sign up as a SEND supporter, and you'll get to pitch blogs, come to our events, and be part of the SEND community. Thank you very much, and have a great conference.
Yes, yeah. Nature of these things.
When you say this government has done more, which one do you mean?
Yeah, come on now.
You guys have got loads of priorities as well.
Yeah. That's great.
And they're often have you come across a guy called Laszlo Barabasi? He's an American physicist who he wrote an amazing book called Linked. He made his name looking at networks and like the internet and like pointed out some of the problems with the internet. And he's now working on food. And he's constructing a database of the hidden chemicals in food. So
I'll see you around there.
I'm doing another one tomorrow.
You are.
So basically, he's saying like the USDA, I think they list 160 or 600 different nutrients, and in garlic there are 18,000. And he's trying to map those, and then he's looked at processed foods and shown that even though at a macronutrient level they look the same, when you look at the stuff that isn't even the USDA, they're very different. And he's beginning to say, maybe, think about maybe this is where the processed food etc. is going. So it'd be just worth, in terms of your stuff, just keeping an eye on Laszlo Barabasi, Harvard. But he's being funded by Rockefeller to create this big database.
I'll tell Jack, he'll remember that.
Hi. Thomas from HSIS. Oh, hi. Hi, how are you? Yeah, how are you doing? Hi.
Just one thing,
I'm speaking on your next panel.
Yes.
So.
Do you have some speakers?
Yeah, I don't. I haven't had a glass, so yeah, probably needs fresh ones, I guess.
Thanks for speaking.
That's all right. I'm going to go to the loo. You know where the nearest loos are?